Hello, economic students. I want to start our lesson today by looking at this table. What you see here are hourly wages that could be offered for a manual labor unskilled type job, and the demand for workers at each wage that's being offered, and the supply of workers at each wage that would be offered. So when we're looking at the demand for workers, what that means is that is referring to the number of workers that would be hired by an employer at the particular wage that is shown. The supply of workers represents the number of people who would be willing to work for the hourly wage that is shown. So if we look at the first wage shown, that is $2 per hour. At $2 per hour, there's going to be a demand for 30 workers for whatever this unskilled job is. However, that's a very low wage. The supply of workers, that is the number of people willing to work for $2 per hour, is 0. Now, as we increase that hourly wage, you can see that the demand for workers, the quantity demanded, starts to go down. That's because of the law of demand, which says that as prices go up, the quantity demanded goes down. That is an inverse relationship between the price and the quantity demanded, the law of demand. We can also see, similarly, the law of supply at work in this table. As the price goes up, the supply will also go up. That is, the quantity supplied will go up as the price offered goes up. That's the positive relationship between the quantity supplied and the price of the product or service or commodity. Now then, as we look at this, there are some people who are willing to work for fairly low wages, and at those low wages, the demand for the workers is going to be quite high. You can also see where we have an equilibrium price for labor. The equilibrium price is $10 per hour, at which point you're going to have the demand for workers equal the supply of workers. In this case, 15 workers demanded, 15 workers supplied. $10 per hour is the equilibrium. That would be the price that would be ideal in this scenario. Now, are there some workers who are willing to work for less than the equilibrium? Yes, of course there are. We can see that in this table right here. Some people are, in fact, willing to work for less than the equilibrium. Likewise, some companies are willing to hire workers for more than the equilibrium price of labor, as you can see down here. Eventually, of course, that will change, and when we get to $15 per hour, the demand for workers is going to be 0. None of the employers want to spend that kind of money, but there would be a very high supply of workers at that price. So what this does is gets us to our next concept as we get into the deeper aspects of supply and demand. And that's the concept of consumer and producer surpluses. So I have two definitions for you here. The consumer surplus is the difference between the maximum price that consumers are willing and able to pay for a product and the actual price that they pay. Okay, in an ideal situation, there will be some consumers who are willing to pay more than what they actually have to pay. That is, they will pay more than what the equilibrium is, and that is the consumer surplus. We're doing good if we're getting the product for less than what we're willing to pay for that product. And then we also have the producer surplus, which is the difference between the actual price producers receive for a product and the price that producers are willing to receive in order to produce the product. So if I'm willing to produce a product for an amount of money that is less than equilibrium, then that would be producing a producer surplus. It would be generating a producer surplus. So let's take a look at see how this looks in supply and demand graphing. Okay, so I'm going to start by just showing the demand curve. And you can see where the equilibrium price is. That's PE for the equilibrium price. And if I go ahead and add a little bit here, I'm going to show you now in the red shaded area the consumer surplus. This represents money that people would have been willing to buy for the product or pay for the product that they didn't have to because the product is priced at equilibrium. But there are some consumers who would have been willing to pay more than what the equilibrium price is, and that amount of money that they are willing to pay but don't have to pay would be considered the consumer surplus, and that is showing here in red on the graph. Now let's add into this scenario supply. And now we see again the equilibrium price, and the blue area that is shaded represents the producer surplus. This is the amount of money that producers would have been willing to spend on this product, on making this product, but they don't have to spend it because the price of the product is at equilibrium. They would have been willing to spend more than equilibrium. Now, not all producers would have been willing to, but some would have been. And for those producers who would have been willing to spend more than the equilibrium price, or provide the service, I should say, for less than the equilibrium price, then they're getting a better deal. They're getting a producer surplus. They would have been willing to accept less than equilibrium, but they're getting the equilibrium, so they're getting a good deal from their perspective. They would have been willing to take less than that. So that is the producer surplus, and it's based on the supply line, as you see, relative to the equilibrium price. And if we add the two lines together, supply and demand, it looks like this. So we have the consumer surplus on the top and the producer surplus on the bottom. Now, oftentimes things are not priced at equilibrium, as we know. And that means that we could potentially have a surplus or a shortage. And that's going to complicate this graph a little bit. So let's see how that works. Let's say that we have a shortage because we're charging a price that is less than equilibrium. Okay, if we're charging less than equilibrium, let's say, then we're at B. If we were to extend this B all the way to the price line, that would be the price that we are charging here. We have a shortage, and that means that we have what's called dead weight. Dead weight is a loss of efficiency. Dead weight for underproduction is shown by the triangle that you see here, bounded by A, E, and B. That's dead weight. This represents the loss of revenue that could be going towards producers, and it also represents the loss of revenue or money that could be going to consumers to meet their needs. Consumers are not able to have their needs met. Some aren't able to because of the shortage. They're willing to spend that money, but they cannot, and that's represented in here. It's limiting the consumer surplus, and it is also limiting the amount of the producer surplus. The shortage does, and this is a lack of efficiency. Our resources are not being used in an efficient way in this scenario. So this is what happens when you have a shortage. Let's see what happens when you have a surplus. In a surplus situation, we still have dead weight, the loss of efficiency, and the dead weight is from overproduction, and is represented by the triangle E, D, and F. And here we see that things are priced at D. If I bring D over here to the price line, that's where the pricing is. And we therefore have a surplus because we're pricing above equilibrium, which means that producers are producing more than they should be. They're producing stuff that's not being sold. And consumers with this surplus are not having their needs or wants met because things are being priced too high. If things were priced at equilibrium, more needs and wants would be fulfilled by consumers than are when we're pricing too high. Again, this is a dead weight, a loss of efficiency, and in both cases, whether it's dead weight as a result of a surplus or dead weight as a result of a shortage, either way, needs are not being met, and the revenue available to producers is being minimized. It's not being realized fully. So that represents consumer and producer surpluses and dead weight. This is something I want to make sure you understand. I want to make sure you can recognize it when you see it on a graph. And in the future, when you have a test, you might find that you would be asked to identify, say, what is triangle EDF? What does that represent? And you would be expected to know that that would be dead weight from overproduction or dead weight from a surplus. Similarly, I would want you to be able to recognize a triangle that would be dead weight created by a shortage or underproduction. I probably won't have you create these graphs from scratch, but I do think you need to recognize when you see the graph what you're seeing. And with that, we're going to stop this presentation and check to see whether or not you have some homework. I think there's a good chance you do. Have a great day.